I've made fun of creepypastas before on this channel, but I'd be lying if I said they didn't hold a special place in my heart. At the height of creepypasta popularity in the early 2010s, I wasn't interested as much in the original stories, but rather the stories based on popular media. You probably think I'm dumb because the original stories were mostly well written, whereas a lot of the hyper-realistic blood and other things people make fun of about creepypastas come from stories based on pre-existing content. It's just fascinating seeing a dark spin on something you grew up with. Like the Max and Ruby 004 Lost Episode creepypasta. This takes me to Pokemon. Pokemon was one of the most popular types of creepypastas in the gaming genre. Although the creepypasta medium is losing steam these days and is mostly considered a dying art form, I thought it'd be fun to travel back to the early 2010s and relive some popular Pokemon creepypastas. Maybe see how they hold up today. Without further ado, let's get straight into it. How could I not start off with Lavender Town Syndrome, likely the most popular Pokemon creepypasta? The story goes as follows. On February 27, 1996, around 200 children aged 7 to 12 years old ended their lives following the release of Pokemon Red and Green in Japan. This happened after the children listened to the Lavender Town theme song, which contained a high-frequency sound adults couldn't pick up on. If the children didn't end up taking their own lives, they suffered from illnesses. As a result, Nintendo re-released the games without the high frequency, and everyone lived happily ever after or something like that. Now, as I mentioned in my Pokemon Red and Blue video, which you should totally go watch, Lavender Town was designed to be creepy, so it would only be natural for there to be dozens of creepypastas surrounding the town. I don't think this creepypasta is terrible, but the premise is downright stupid. I'd rather creepypastas take place in a small town, or be isolated events that would be impossible to track down. That's just my personal preference. It's immersion breaking when you go for something as dark as children taking their own lives, and can do a Google search to know it obviously didn't happen. I'm not trying to take creepypastas too seriously, but my suspension of disbelief is shattered when a story as ridiculous as this comes around. This story reminds me of the SpongeBob Brazilian defecation broadcast, where Squidward hit the brown note on his clarinet or something and caused everyone watching the episode to shit themselves. I think that's a perfect comparison actually. Anyways, Lavender Town Syndrome. It's a classic and the most recognizable Pokemon creepypasta, but also stands as an example of mediocre writing that allows the medium to be made fun of today. With all this in mind, I give Lavender Town Syndrome 5 out of 10 Ghastlies. Next we have another popular creepypasta taking place in Lavender Town, Buried Alive. According to the story, Buried Alive was meant to be the original boss of the Pokemon Tower before being replaced with Marowak's ghost. This trainer would use a Gengar, Muck, and 2 white hands. If the player won this battle, the game would freeze because no script was ever written for a victory. If the player lost, however, Buried Alive would say, "Finally, fresh meat," and the game would display a screen of the creature devouring red. This image would then be downloaded into the game's internal memory and replace the title screen. Now, I really like this creepypasta. Why? Because of the amount of effort put into it. Sprite work was actually done in order to add a sense of realism to the story, and it's not bad sprite work, it's very well done. Outside of that, the story is a bit too simplistic. I like the angle that Buried Alive was the original boss for the Pokemon Tower, making it seem like this was all created by Nintendo themselves before they realized their mistakes. That's better to me than a supernatural entity haunting the cartridge. All in all, Buried Alive is the type of creepypasta I enjoy. It goes above and beyond to maintain realism through its story and its art. I just wish the story was a bit more nuanced. I'm giving Buried Alive 7 out of 10 Ghastlies. This next one is interesting. Easter egg, Snow on Mount Silver. The story follows 2 siblings who use the Game Shark on their Pokemon games, Angie and her brother. Angie, our protagonist, one morning found Game Boy cartridges mangled all over the floor. She went to her brother's room where she found him looking pale with a hammer, their mother's gardening scissors, a smashed Game Boy, and their Game Shark with a copy of Pokemon Silver sticking out. Now, Angie's brother was incredibly paranoid, even throwing her Game Boy at the wall. Her brother ended up in a psych ward where he told Angie to go to his room and get rid of the Game Boy and Game Shark. But of course, in typical creepypasta fashion, Angie got curious. Despite her brother's wishes, Angie booted up the copy of Pokemon Silver and was met with the Mount Silver map and the static-like sound of heavy snowfall coming from the Game Boy speakers. Angie noticed the Pokemon and player sprite looked frostbitten, but decided to press on. She kept getting ominous messages each time she attempted going down the mountain, so the only way forward was up. As Angie progressed up the lifeless mountain, her player sprite became slower and her Pokemon began dying, their sprites now mutilated. To keep it brief, Angie eventually fought a decaying Celebi, reddened his frostbitten Pokemon, and after many grotesque images, ear-piercing screeches from the Game Boy, and disturbing text boxes, Angie eventually threw the game out and the story ends. That was a doozy. After taking some time to gather my thoughts, I decided to go through the negatives first. This story has every single creepypasta cliche imaginable. I could look at the toilet paper after wiping my ass and have a better story than this. I mean, a Game Shark somehow possesses Pokemon Silver, or they just played a well done ROM hack? Either way, it's not an interesting premise. What I enjoy about this creepypasta is the actual ROM hack inspired by it, incorporating everything from the story down to the finest details. That's the gameplay you've been seeing on screen, and I'll also link this video in the description below. It's awesome that people were able to code and create art for this story in a playable format, when many creepypastas can barely churn out a decent story. A lot of people seem to really enjoy this creepypasta, but even when I was younger, this one never really stood out when every other story was, "Oh my god, my game came to life and started being spooky." I'm giving Easter Egg, Snow on Mount Silver, 6 out of 10 Ghastlies. The last creepypasta I want to look at is Lost Silver. If you're familiar with creepypastas, you'll know this one is arguably just as popular as Lavender Town Syndrome. You'll also know this one is very similar to Snow on Mount Silver, so why am I covering it here? Because to me, this is the better creepypasta of the two, and an example of what to do right, whereas Snow on Mount Silver is an example of everything that can go wrong when writing a creepypasta. To avoid being repetitive, the protagonist of Lost Silver plays a haunted copy of, well, Pokemon Silver. Their party consists of a Cyndaquil nicknamed Hurry, and 5 unknowns that spell out Leave. It turns out, unsurprisingly, that the game is really unsettling and has a deep backstory, but the story ultimately ends with the protagonist giving up after getting stuck. Now that was an incredibly brief overview. I'm just really excited to share my thoughts. You see, what Lost Silver does right with its story is being creative. Having the unknown Pokemon spell out messages throughout the story is a clever spin on how they normally function in standard Pokemon games. Additionally, care was clearly put into writing this story because it hints at an overarching narrative and backstory, which is paid off in the sequel story Lost Silver Ashes. And of course, a very well done fan game, no, not a ROM hack, was made so that people can experience the story themselves. It's a project that gets occasional updates throughout the years, with the last one being in 2020 to celebrate the game's 10th anniversary. While Lost Silver definitely contains cliches of its own, the amount of dedication that went into this project cannot be overlooked. Lost Silver deserves the praise it gets. And with that being said, I'm giving Lost Silver 9 out of 10 Ghastlies. I always thought covering creepypastas on this channel would be boring because they're not only so old, but a lot of them are very poorly written. However, making this video in a retrospective-like format was actually a lot of fun. I enjoyed being transported back to an older time and seeing how these popular campfire stories held up today. Although I'll be ending the video here, you may have noticed the title contains Volume 1. Stay tuned, and as always, have a good one.